Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for tuning in. John Kelly Profiler here, and welcome to STALK Incorporated. This is a special Viewer's Choice edition we're doing today. I'm very fortunate to have some members of the STALK team here, primary members, I may add. Today we're going to be talking about the murders in Chicago. We've got 55 women found murdered there, going back to early 2000s. And the question that everybody's asking out there is it a serial killer? Do we have a serial killer out there in Chicago? So, we're going to be looking into it today. As these kinds of cases go, I feel my two partners are probably two of the best people in the country to look at these cases. Number one, we have Frank Adamson, who was the longest running commander of the Green River Task Force. I'm sure many of you are responsible with the Green River Task Force. Frank was responsible with other members of the Green River Task Force with the final apprehension of Gary Ridgway. And in the Green River case, you did have in the high 40s and approximately 50 women murdered, women who got involved in prostitution murdered. And the sad part of it is that it was one guy pretty much for 99.9% of these cases. Also, we're lucky to have today Dr. Eddie Mirsky. I'll refer to him as Eddie. But Dr. Edwin Mirsky is a doctor of psychology. He's not a PhD. He's a PsyD. He is a pure psychologist. He's the purest of the pure when it comes to psychology, okay? I've just been so fortunate to work with him for so many years, and I've learned an awful lot from him, as I've also learned a lot from Frank too over the years, quite a bit. And so these two guys have been very instrumental in my progression through the field of psychotherapy and into the field of criminology. I am not a criminologist, though, but I do consider myself a decent profile. I'm a pretty good profiler. So anyway, with that being said, again, welcome. And let's get on with this and find out what's going on in Chicago. These sad women, I mean, it's a sad situation. The saddest part of this is that these women, and I would guess to say the vast majority, if not all of them, were drug addicted, and these women were enslaved. They were actually enslaved, to drugs on the streets of Chicago. And I think lots of times we don't talk about separating the woman who once was a little child from the profession. So these are women first, and secondly, they are drugged, enslaved prostitutes. Now, I can't imagine any young girl, any little girl, 8 or 9 years old, 7 years old, sitting on their bed, talking about or fantasizing about growing up to become a drug addicted, enslaved prostitute on the streets of Chicago. And that's what we all have to remember here. These women were human, and we need to look at the humanity piece of it first, and their prostitution, their profession second, and a very dangerous profession. Frank, you read the information. You've looked at this case. Can you tell me your feelings on this case? Do we have a serial killer running around Chicago killing these women?
Well, I'm not sure that there necessarily is a serial here. Of the 55 women that were killed, apparently they've got DNA in 21 different cases, and in those cases, none of the DNA matched. So what we may have here are, in a couple cases, we've got the same person killing a victim, but it's not necessarily so. I think what's important to remember here is that any murder is sad and ought not happen. And it would really be wonderful if the Chicago Police Department can solve more of these crimes and put the perpetrator away where he belongs.
Hey, Frank, I'm going to ask you that question again. The different DNA that they found, can you elaborate on that? You were mentioning it earlier.
Well, DNA found at the crime scene can come from a number of sources. If it comes from the suspect, then it's a very effective tool in both convicting the suspect and also relating the crime. So if you have the same DNA on several victims, you know you've got a serial killer. If you don't have DNA on several victims, then you've got separate killers.
Eddie, when we talk about these kinds of cases, and we look at these women going into, these very high risk, dangerous situations, and we know they're going into it because of the drugs. I mean, what do you think about that psychologically? I mean, like, they get addicted to heroin or crack, coke, whatever it could be. The one thing we know for sure is that they're getting some kind of relief from, they started getting into this drug culture because they were seeking some kind of relief from the trauma. I mean, in your years of practice, do you see any evidence where people go to different substances to seek some kind of relief from underlying trauma?
Oh, sure. Yeah, there's, most cases you see, there's some kind of trauma involved. Could even be simple as bullying or, family problems, drug, alcohol on part of either parent, sexual abuse, very, very big. Finding that more and more, obviously, even in media. And so, yeah, there's always some kind of, you care to do a good history, and it's not uncommon where people may not even want to reveal it in the beginning. It comes out later. I've had quite a few cases where people, they might be session 5, 10, 20, and they just break down and start sobbing, and they said, I didn't want to tell you this before, but I think it's time I let you know. They maybe even lied in the beginning about like sexual abuse, sexual maltreatment. So yeah, that's a very common factor in many of these cases. Like you said, these women probably never envisioned that they were going to be on the streets prostituting in a very highly dangerous profession, if you want to call it a profession. But basically, they're using the drugs most likely as a maladaptive way of coping with a lot of trauma and abuse. And then it just kind of spirals from there. They get usually a pimp involved, right? And they can be very brutal and very controlling, and it goes from there. Um, but yeah, solving these cases is very important just for society. We need to, as best as possible, get as much evidence and put these perps away, because they're not shouldn't be walking around.
Frank, you and I were talking a little bit earlier, and you brought up about the Runaways. When you were running the Green River case, again, so the public understands, you were running the biggest serial killer case in U.S. history. Green River, Gary Ridgway killed over 50 women, and I don't even think that's the final count yet. But anyway, when you were running that case, you talked about a lot of the victims being runaways who then got mixed up with a pimp, Mr. Wrong. They got mixed up with Mr. Wrong, and they started to be abused by, like Eddie said, the pimp. What was that like for you when you saw that situation, or anything you have to add at all to seeing this unfold?
Well, many of the victims in Green River started their prostitution as runaways. They were a child who had run away from home, and they were vulnerable, and they were victimized. And when you don't have people to support you around you at the time, it's very easy to be victimized. And I think that was kind of the lesson in Green River. And I think the other thing that needs to be said is that all of the victims have mothers, some of them have children. There's a lot of victimization that goes beyond the individual that's killed. And it's sad, because they're very decent human beings.
Frank, with all this being said, and these women being victimized by drugs and then by the murderers, and their families being victimized as well, you've got to start somewhere when you have a case like this on your hands. If this was you, if you were running this case, and we're not making it sound like you want to run it or we want to run it or be involved in it in any way, but I'm just trying to figure out how you would start with a case like this, how you would, follow through on the investigation. What would you do, Frank? Because it's over the years. There's all these women murdered in certain areas. What would you do?
Well, I think I do probably what the Chicago police are doing. They go back to the original case, and each of these victims had a case file. They go back and they review that case file. They go back and look at the evidence that they picked up in those scenes. And if they have DNA, certainly they have it analyzed. And maybe someone missed something, or maybe someone didn't see something. So it's really a process of reviewing and making sure that you were as complete in your investigation as you could possibly be. And sometimes it helps to have a different individual look at the case. We found in Green River that different detectives looking at the same case can come up with different ideas about the information that's actually already in the case.
Yeah, I remember looking at that when you talk about different individuals. And that impressed me so much about you, and I didn't even know you at the time. but I read the different books that were out there and I felt like I knew you. And I could see that you were actually bringing in really very, very good detectives from Los Angeles and from wherever to try and give you any kind of inclination on who this killer could be. You worked very closely with the FBI. You were arm in arm with John Douglas. I mean, John Douglas, you had him in on this case. It certainly took a toll on John Douglas. God bless him. He almost died, I think, on this case. I mean, he got pretty sick anyway. But the point I'm trying to make is, you did not spare any money or anything. You brought in anybody that you felt, including me, that could help you solve this case. Okay? And certainly I did not, help you solve this case. I was in John Douglas's camp and both of us focused on the wrong guy, not Gary Ridgway. But the bottom line is you brought in the resources you felt needed, no matter what the cost, to get this done. Okay? And you were not worried about money. You weren't worried about turf control. You were worried about getting the case solved and stopping this guy from killing more women. All right. And was that seemed to be a common theme with the task force. When I was out there with you guys, I never met a better bunch of people. I mean, you guys were just all genuinely focused on doing the right thing and bringing this guy down. And you did it. Do you want to talk about, forming a task force and keeping a task force moving? And don't forget the other thing too, back in those days, wasn't a whole lot of stuff computerized. It was your decision, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, to make sure everything, because you had tons and tons and tons of information and calls coming in and everything else. Didn't you turn around and were one of the first to computerize everything? I forget exactly how you documented everything, but.
Yeah, well, ultimately, the case was solved by good initial crime scene work, because DNA is what broke the case. And at the time that they picked up the items that were later to become the DNA, DNA wasn't something that we thought about. It was developed after that. But the good crime scene processing is really important early on in the case, and that was done quite well. Over time, it was also interesting that the investigators were able to go back and pick up items that they had in the past and have them evaluated by the crime lab, and they ultimately also redounded in the solution of this case. So that's important. We had good outside advice from a number of different places and people. The late Pierce Brooks came and visited the task force, and he reviewed what we had done, and he was quite satisfied with, the progress of the investigation. And I thought that was an important element. Bob Keppel was loaned from the Attorney General's office, and Bob did a wonderful job of motivating and sharing his ideas with members of the task force, many of whom he was familiar with because at an earlier time, Bob had been a member of the King County Police Department. But we had a lot of help from outside. The FBI came in and did a profile, and I found that helpful. So there are a number of different things. We sent people actually out of state to process scenes, and in order to try to determine if our suspect had gone elsewhere, and he did in fact go to Portland, and we actually picked up a couple of victims from there, and he'd actually transported the bones from one of the victims down to Portland to kind of throw the task force off. So all these things, came together. But one of the most important things that happened during the case was the organization of the case files and the organization of the evidence. And we had a number of marvelous detectives that put that together, and I can't say enough for them.
No, I mean, you got to give a lot of credit to you guys and the whole Green River Task Force, living and dead, for a job well done, and sitting on that DNA for what, 20 years? I mean, by the time it was resolved, or am I wrong? By the time you were able to connect it to Gary Ridgway?
Yeah, it was actually one detective stayed with the case for that 20 years, and he actually took the DNA sample that pointed toward Ridgway, and that broke the case, and that was around 2001, and our case started in 1982.
And you had some really good people, like you said, working with it. I mean, you had Pierce Brooks, you had John Douglas, and you had Bob Keppel, who had wrote some pretty good books. Eddie, we were talking about, the trauma that the victims suffer and the abuse they endured while they were children. We've talked about that a little bit. What I'd like you to talk about, if you would talk about the family members of the victims being traumatized by their deaths. What's that like? Well, you and I both know what it's like, but the audience doesn't know. What is it like? Most of the audience, I would suspect. What is it like when a mother loses a child, or a father loses a child, or siblings lose a sibling? You want to talk about that?
Sure. Well, it's certainly devastating to the family. That goes without saying. Some families aren't even aware that their daughter was in this business profession. They are shocked to even hear that for the first time. They might have known that they had some drug problems, but they're, they can be pretty. So it's almost like a double shock to learn that they were in this line of work, and then that they were murdered. But because, like you mentioned earlier, because they chose this line of work does not mean they're less of a person, they're less of a human being. Families can certainly be devastated. A lot of these women do have children, young children, even though they've probably been estranged. Not in every case, some cases, but families deserve some kind of closure, and that's, I guess, kind of what we're in the business of as profilers, trying to get some closure. Even though they say most people that have lost loved ones, they say you never really have closure.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
Get them justice. We get them justice, though. Go ahead.
Yeah. If we can get justice, that helps a little. You know, it's certainly no panacea, but it does help. Um, and that's our goal. And from what I understand, you know, Chicago now has they're just starting a task force to try to resolve a lot of these cases. And following up on what Frank said, I think they'd be wise to look at how that was handled and use all the resources possible. Use profilers, use the FBI, use a fresh pair of eyes, like Frank said. You know, that could be very helpful. Um, I guess there's still the central question you brought up earlier: is there one or two maybe serial killers running around? I guess at first glance it seems like the answer would be no, but I guess they're still trying to really find that out. Um, but yeah, getting some kind of closure, some kind of justice would be a small step in the healing process. Even though he said there's never closure. I have people in my practice that lost loved ones, from weeks ago to years ago, and it's still very painful. They still almost always start crying, and you gotta give them the box of tissues, and they gotta still process a lot of that. It doesn't matter if it's weeks or years.
What I've found is that it creates a hole in their heart that never heals. They cope with it better over time, especially if they have other kids,
Mm-hmm.
but it never heals, and what we do, like we said, we help somewhat in the healing process. We can help them with justice, but really we can't we can't we can't create closure. I mean, it's an open wound in their heart that they seem to deal with, as long as they're on. They cope with it better and deal with it, but it's there. It never entirely heals. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that my experience. Like you said, it's a nice word to use. It sounds like closure. People even say sometimes, "Oh, it's been a long time. You should be over this by now, or should be recovered by now." But that's not what I found. It's yes, people do get better psychologically. They do move on. They still have to function. Many people, as you know, they turn the tragedy into something positive. Like the recent case. It's not related, but the case in South Carolina where the woman was killed by the fake Uber driver. So that family is now trying to change a lot of the rules and regulations, and which could certainly have a real positive effect. We got to prevent this from happening again. It's bizarre how it happened, but I guess it could happen again. So I know that family is very involved in, making all or enforcing rules that were probably there, or coming up with some new rules. But that does help you cope. That you can be helpful in the future and prevent these incidents from happening again.
Yeah, I give that family a lot of credit, and certainly I forget their names off the top of my head. I mean, I've
So
seen.
yeah,
Certainly we send our sympathies and condolences. Okay, so going back to this, um, I think it's important for us to think about this question that everybody has: is there a serial killer in Chicago? And my feelings are, with all these women being found murdered over the years, that we probably have multiple serial killers. Frank, what's your thought on that?
Well, my thought is that we're talking about maybe an 18-year period here, in a city that has a population of nearly 3 million people. So I think it's an open question whether indeed there are serials in here or not. And I think the only way you can resolve that is the way Chicago probably will resolve that, is to go back and look at the cases and see if they can make matches. If they can't make matches, then they'll have to presume that there was no serial. If they can, then they can presume that there are serials.
And I guess that's the, I guess that's the ultimate final answer. There's no other way to do it. Okay, this is the way it has to be done. And if anybody would know, you would know. Is there anything you guys have to say that I missed? Is there anything you want to talk about before we close today?
I guess, do we know, let's say this task force they've set up in Chicago, do you know when that started maybe, or who's on the task force? I assume that's all, are there current detectives and maybe sometimes retired detectives get involved with that? Or even detectives from other places, like you said, for the series, for the Green River Killer, you brought in people from other areas, get some fresh ideas. Is Chicago going to do that, or are they doing that? Do we know?
That's an excellent question, and we don't know.
Okay.
I think we will find out sooner than later, though, because this is picking up more and more speed in the media, and people want to know who killed these women, and not only people in Chicago. Frank, any closing words, any words of wisdom on this case?
I don't have many words of wisdom. I think
Sure.
I think you have to remember that the victims were loved and have given love, and it's important to give their cases adequate investigation. And as I understand it, Chicago is utilizing at least 6 detectives right now, and hopefully they'll make some headway, and hopefully some of these cases will be solved, if not all of them.
Words of wisdom, Frank. Thank you, guys. Thank you for making time today to do this. Appreciate it. And I'll be in touch with you guys sooner than later.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Take care.
All right. You're very welcome. All right.
Thank you all so much for watching today. We truly appreciate you, and we truly appreciate your feedback. We love your comments. We love your input, and we're overwhelmed and can't thank you enough for all the subscriptions. So please continue to tell us what you think. Make it a great day. Stay safe out there. Thanks again.